Josephine Calloway did not cry when Cornelius Whitmore slid the foreclosure notice across his mahogany desk and told her, gently, that some things simply could not be saved. She read it twice. She folded it along its crease, the way she might fold away a feed bill, and tucked it inside her coat. She thanked him for his time. She walked out of the Larkspur Trust and Savings Bank with her spine straight and her boots loud on the boardwalk, and she did not stop walking until she reached her horse. She rode home in the dark. She unsaddled the mare, hauled 2 buckets of water to the trough, and then, because her hands needed something to do that her mind could not argue with, she took up a hammer and mended a fence line that did not need mending until well past midnight, until her knuckles split and her palms bled through her gloves. If you have ever stood at the edge of losing everything you built with your own 2 hands, while someone smiled at you and called it business, this story is for you. If that hit you somewhere true, hit subscribe, because this channel tells stories about women the world underestimated and men who saw them clearly anyway. Drop the name of your town in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the end, because what happened 3 weeks later, in front of the whole town of Larkspur, is something nobody who witnessed it ever forgot. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Larkspur, Montana Territory, the spring of 1886. Larkspur sat in a green fold of the Montana high country, a town of 1 bank, 2 churches, a mercantile, and more cattle than people. The Calloway Ranch lay 4 miles north of it, 1,100 acres of good grass, and a spring-fed creek that never ran dry, even in August. Land that Josephine Calloway's father had broken his back building for 23 years before a fever took him the winter past. Josie was 28, heavy-set in the way of a woman who had spent her whole life doing a man's work, wide shoulders earned from hauling feed sacks, strong forearms from years of fence work and calving season, a frame built by labor rather than leisure. She rose before dawn, and she was usually still moving well after supper, and there was not a hand on the ranch, hired or otherwise, who could outwork her by sundown. That morning she was down at the south pasture, up to her elbows in a breech berth, talking low and steady to a heifer who did not want to cooperate, when she heard the wagon coming up the drive. She did not stop working. She rarely did. "You'll want to see this," Tobias Reyes called down from the fence rail. Tobias had worked the Calloway spread since before Josie could walk, and in the 11 months since her father's death, he was the only hand who hadn't quietly found work elsewhere. She finished with the heifer first. The calf came wet and shaking, and Josie wiped it down with her own coat before she straightened up, wiped her hands on her trousers, and walked up to see what couldn't wait. It was a letter from the bank. Her father's note, the loan he'd taken 3 years back to buy the North grazing lease, was coming due for renewal, and renewal required a face-to-face meeting. Josie had known this was coming. She had also known, in the tired, clear-eyed way a person knows a storm is close before the sky changes color, that it would not be simple. It was not simple. In town 2 days later, she stood in front of the loan officer's desk at the Larkspur Trust and Savings Bank, not Cornelius Whitmore himself, not yet, just a junior clerk named Pruitt, and watched him look at her ledgers, her father's death certificate, and her own 2 capable hands, and reach the same conclusion 3 different ways. "It isn't usual," Pruitt said, not unkindly, "for a note like this to be held by, well, by a woman alone." "The ranch isn't alone," Josie said. "I've got 4 hands, 2,000 head, and a creek that's never gone dry in 23 years. The collateral hasn't changed. Only the name on the note has." Pruitt folded his hands. "I'll pass it along to Mr. Whitmore," he said, in the voice of a man already certain what the answer would be. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She thanked him, gathered her papers, and walked out past the front window, where 2 women from the sewing circle stood close together, watching her go. Poor thing, one of them murmured, not quite low enough. Carrying that whole ranch on those shoulders. No wonder the banks won't have her. A woman built like that, alone out there. Who'd trust her to hold a note? Josie heard every word. She did not turn around. She untied her horse, mounted in one clean motion, and rode home with her chin level and her jaw tight, and if her eyes stung on the ride, there was no one out on that road to see it. That same week, on the far side of the valley, Emmett Cole was breaking a green colt in the round pen behind his own considerable spread, 6,000 acres, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and a house too big for the one man who lived in it. Emmett was 34, lean and quiet, the kind of man who said perhaps 40 words a day and meant every one of them. Folks in Larkspur called him the Lonely Cowboy, not unkindly. He'd buried a wife and an infant son to a fever 8 years back, and since then he had built his ranch into the richest in the territory and spoken to almost no one about anything that wasn't cattle, weather, or grass. His foreman, a broad old Swede named Nils, found him that evening mending a bridle by lamplight. "Heard the Calloway girl's note is up for renewal," Nils said, testing the water the way a man does with someone he respects but doesn't quite know how to reach. "Heard the bank's giving her trouble over it." Emmett did not look up from the bridle. "That's so. Whitmore's been talking around town. Says a woman alone can't be trusted to hold that kind of note. Says it real polite, though. You know how he does." Emmett set the bridle down. He had ridden the boundary line between the Calloway spread and his own 100 times over the years, had spoken to Josephine Calloway perhaps a dozen times total, mostly about a shared culvert where their 2 creeks met. He remembered, without particularly trying to, that she had once talked him through gentling a spooked horse with more patience and more sense than any man he'd hired in a decade. He didn't say anything more that night. Nils had worked for him long enough to know when a conversation was finished, and long enough, too, to notice the particular stillness that came over Emmett whenever the Calloway name was mentioned. Not longing exactly, but the quiet attention of a man taking careful stock of something he hadn't let himself consider before. The next morning, Emmett saddled his horse before the sun had fully cleared the ridge and rode toward the Calloway boundary line, on a pretext about the culvert that both of them, eventually, would come to understand was never really about the culvert at all. He passed his own north herd on the way, 2,000 head grazing fat on spring grass, tended by 6 hired hands and a foreman who managed most of it without needing him. It occurred to him, not for the first time, how much of his own success had come easily. Inherited land, inherited capital, a name that opened doors before he'd said a word through them. He had never once had to prove, to a room full of strangers, that he deserved to hold what was his. The culvert where Cole land met Calloway land had needed clearing exactly once, in April, after a hard rain washed debris downstream. Emmett cleared it in 20 minutes. Then, the following Sunday, he rode out again anyway and found Josie already there, checking the same stretch of fence with a roll of wire over her shoulder. "Culvert's holding," he said, by way of greeting. "I know," she said. "I checked it Tuesday." He nodded slowly, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "Fence needs mending here," he said, nodding to a sagging post. "Been meaning to get to it." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if he'd been caught at something. "You don't need my permission to fix a boundary fence, Mr. Cole." "No," he agreed, "but it runs both our sides. Seemed only right to ask." She handed him a pair of fencing pliers without another word, and they worked the post together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and when they finished, he tipped his hat and rode home, and neither of them mentioned that the culvert had never truly needed him at all. It became, without either of them naming it, a Sunday ritual. Emmett would ride the boundary line under some small pretext, a loose post, a strayed steer, a report of wolf tracks, and Josie would be there, or would arrive shortly after, and they would work some small piece of fence or ditch together and talk about things that were not romance at all. The going price of beef in Miles Crossing, the best way to break a colt without breaking his spirit, whether spring grass would hold if the rains stayed light. "You talk to animals different than most men do," she told him once, watching him calm a nervous gelding with nothing but a low voice and a steady hand. "Animals don't lie to you about what they need," Emmett said. "People do that. Animals just tell you plain. That why you'd rather talk to them than to half this county." He considered that longer than the question probably deserved. "Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe I just never found many people worth the trouble of talking to." She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten out before she could decide whether to let it, and he found he wanted very badly to hear it again. He never once mentioned her size, her weight, the shape of her, not to praise it, not to excuse it, not at all. He looked at her the way he looked at good grazing land or a well-built fence, as something worth the trouble of understanding properly. He asked her about her cattle-buying strategy and actually waited for the answer. He called her Josephine, never Miss Calloway, in that careful, pitying tone the bank clerks used, and never poor Josie, the way the sewing circle did behind gloved hands. It was, she came to realize over 6 Sundays of fence work and quiet talk, the first time in longer than she could remember that a man had looked at her and simply seen a rancher, competent, capable, worth listening to, rather than a problem to be managed or a shape to be pitied. She did not tell him about the bank, not at first. It wasn't his trouble to carry. But by the 5th Sunday, when he asked plainly how the note renewal was going, she found she couldn't quite lie to him either. "Not well," she said. "Whitmore's stalling. Says he needs to review it further. Says it delicately, like the trouble's my collateral and not my last name being a woman's." Emmett's jaw went tight in a way she hadn't seen before. "You've got the collateral. Everyone in this valley knows that ranch runs clean." "I know what I've got," Josie said. "Question is whether Whitmore's willing to admit it." He didn't say much more that day, but he rode home slower than usual, turning something over in his mind that he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. The Sunday after that, he arrived to find her already deep in an argument with a cattle buyer from Miles Crossing who was trying to shave $2 a head off a price they'd agreed on the week before. Emmett said nothing, only leaned against the fence rail and watched her work the man down to a fair number through patience and plain arithmetic rather than raised voices, and when the buyer had ridden off, grumbling but paid fair, Emmett found himself smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar on his own face. "You didn't need to watch that," Josie said, not quite looking at him. "Wanted to," Emmett said. "Man tries to shortchange you every season?" "Every season," she said. "Figures a woman won't remember last year's price. He figures wrong." "Most men do," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, tired but not bitter, the way a person speaks of weather they've long since stopped fighting, that told him more about the last 11 months of her life than any full account could have. He thought about that on the ride home, the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by nearly everyone a person did business with, day after day, and never once being allowed the relief of simply being taken at her word. The bank's answer came 2 weeks later, and it came with company. Josie stood in the Larkspur Trust and Savings lobby, note papers in hand, when Cornelius Whitmore himself finally emerged from his office. A soft, well-fed man in a fine gray suit, smiling the particular smile of a man who has already decided the outcome and is merely enjoying the ceremony of delivering it. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I've reviewed your renewal personally. I'm afraid the board has concerns." "What concerns?" Josie said. "The ranch turned a profit every year my father held that note, and every month since I've held it myself." "It isn't a question of profit. Whitmore said, folding his hands the way men like him always did, before saying something unkind in a kind voice. It's a question of continuity, reliability. A note like this needs a steady hand behind it for the full term. The board simply isn't confident that a woman, running that operation alone, represents the same security. Standing near the window, arranging a display of ribbon for the mercantile next door, was Almira Pruitt, the loan clerk's aunt, and the sharpest tongue in the Larkspur sewing circle. She did not bother lowering her voice. "Bless her heart," Mrs. Pruitt said to no one in particular, though everyone in the lobby heard it plainly. "Carrying that whole ranch on shoulders like hers. It's no wonder the banks won't trust her with it. A woman built that way, out there alone, who'd believe she could hold steady through a hard winter?" The room went quiet in the particular way a room does when everyone is waiting to see whether the target of an insult will break. Josie did not break. She set her papers down on the counter, squared them neatly, and looked directly at Mrs. Pruitt with an expression of perfect, unhurried calm. "I've held that ranch steady through 4 winters now, Mrs. Pruitt, 3 of them without my father. I imagine my shoulders will manage a 4th. She turned back to Whitmore. "I'll expect your answer in writing by Friday, Mr. Whitmore. Good day." She walked out with her chin level, her pace unhurried, and did not so much as glance back at the window where the ribbon display sat forgotten. It was only once she was mounted and well down the road that her hands, gripping the reins, finally shook. She rode home that evening the long way, past the schoolhouse and the little cemetery where her father was buried, and stopped there a while without quite meaning to. She did not talk to the grave the way some people did. She simply stood at the fence, hat in hand, and let herself feel, for a few private minutes, the full weight of what it meant to be doubted by men who had never once lifted a fence post themselves. Tobias found her there near dusk, having ridden out when she hadn't returned by supper. He didn't ask if she was all right. He only handed her the reins of her own horse, which she'd left ground-tied a good while back without noticing, and rode home beside her in silence, the kind of silence that says more about loyalty than words ever could. Friday's answer came, and it was no. The note would not be renewed. Payment in full was required within 30 days, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the Calloway ranch. Josie did not panic. Panicking had never solved a single problem her father hadn't already tried panicking over first. Instead, she did the only sensible thing available to her. She saddled her best horse, packed 2 days of provisions, and rode to find a bank that would take her money in exchange for a loan on land that was, by any honest measure, worth every cent of it. The first bank was in Miles Crossing, half a day's ride east. The manager there was polite, reviewed her papers for the better part of an hour, and then explained, with real apology in his voice, that he'd received a wire from a colleague at Larkspur Trust suggesting the Calloway note carried certain reliability concerns that made the board there uneasy about taking it on. He didn't say Whitmore's name. He didn't need to. She spent that first night in a rented room above the Miles Crossing feed store, too proud to write home about the refusal, and too practical to ride 4 hours back, only to turn around again the next morning. She lay awake a long while, doing the arithmetic of her herd against the arithmetic of her debt, and found, as she always did, that the numbers themselves were perfectly sound. It was only the name attached to them that anyone seemed to doubt. The second bank, in Bitter Creek, a full day further, gave nearly the same answer in different words, a vague unease about continuity of management, a suggestion that perhaps she return with a male co-signer, a husband or a brother, someone the board could feel more settled about. "I don't have a husband or a brother," Josie said. "I have a ranch that turns a profit and a note I can pay." The manager spread his hands helplessly, as though the fault lay with the world rather than with him. "I'm sorry, Miss Calloway. It's simply how the board sees these things." She did not argue further. She had learned, over the course of 2 refusals, that arguing with a man who has already decided the answer only spends time she did not have to spare. She thanked him for his consideration, gathered her papers into her saddlebag, and walked out into a street she did not know, in a town where nobody recognized her name for anything but the ledger she carried, and found that lonelier, in its way, than any insult Larkspur had managed to throw at her. The 3rd refusal came by return post from a bank in Helena she'd written to on the recommendation of a cattle buyer. 3 lines, formal, final, citing insufficient assurance regarding sole female management of a large operation. 3 banks, 3 refusals, and underneath every one of them, if she looked closely enough, the same careful hand. Cornelius Whitmore, wiring ahead of her, making certain that wherever she rode, the door had already quietly closed before she reached it. She learned the truth of it from Tobias, who'd heard it from a freight driver, who'd heard it from a bank runner in Miles Crossing. Whitmore wasn't merely refusing her note out of caution. He wanted the Calloway land outright, specifically the spring-fed creek that ran through it, which a railroad survey crew had quietly confirmed was the only reliable water source along a proposed new spur line. If the ranch went to foreclosure, Whitmore stood to buy it at a fraction of its worth through a silent partner, then sell the water rights to the railroad for a fortune. 23 days remained on the note. Josie rode out to the boundary fence that Sunday not to check for wolf tracks or loose posts, but because she needed, for the first time since her father died, to say the truth out loud to someone who might actually hear it. Emmett listened to all of it without interrupting. The 3 refusals, the wired warnings ahead of her, the railroad's spur line, Whitmore's quiet scheme. When she finished, his jaw was set in the same hard line she'd seen once before. 23 days, he said. 23 days, she agreed, and I've got maybe a third of what's owed, even selling off half the herd at a loss. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the fence line that ran between their 2 properties, a boundary that had never, in truth, kept anything meaningful apart. "Then we'd best make sure it doesn't come to that," he said. She looked at him sharply. "Emmett, I didn't come here asking for—" "I know what you didn't come here asking for," he said. "I'm not offering it because you asked. I'm offering it because I've watched you run that ranch better than most men run theirs, and I'll be damned if I let Cornelius Whitmore take it out from under you over a technicality about who happens to be holding the pen." It was the most words she'd ever heard him say at once. She did not know, standing there at the fence line with her heart going strange and unsteady in her chest, whether to be moved or terrified. She settled, in the end, on something closer to resolve. "He won't make it easy," she said. "Didn't figure he would," Emmett said. "Doesn't much matter." She studied him for a long moment in the fading light, this quiet, careful man who had never once, in all their Sunday conversations, asked her to be smaller, or softer, or more grateful than she felt like being. "Why," she asked finally, "would you put your name on a note that could just as easily cost you if Whitmore digs in?" "Because I've spent 8 years letting this valley call me the Lonely Cowboy," Emmett said, "and mostly I've let it be true because it was easier than caring what happened to anyone else. I'm tired of easier." He looked out at the fence line, at the 2 properties it divided that had never, in any way that mattered, been truly separate. "You're not asking me to save you, Josephine. I know that. I'm asking to stand next to you while you save yourself. There's a difference, and I mean to respect it." She didn't answer right away. But when she reached out and shook his hand on it, the way she might have sealed any other fair business arrangement, both of them understood it as something considerably more than that. Whitmore, when he learned that Emmett Cole intended to co-sign the Calloway note, did not take the news quietly. He called a public meeting at the bank 3 days before the note came due, ostensibly to settle the matter transparently before the whole community. In truth, to humiliate Josie one final time, in front of enough witnesses that no one would question the foreclosure that followed. The lobby of the Larkspur Trust and Savings was packed shoulder to shoulder that morning. Ranchers, shopkeepers, the sewing circle, Mrs. Pruitt with her ribbon forgotten entirely. Whitmore stood behind his desk like a man presiding over a trial he'd already decided. "Miss Calloway," he began, folding his hands in that same practiced, gentle way, "the board has asked me to make one final review of your circumstances, publicly, so that all concerned parties may understand the bank's position is entirely reasonable." "Say what you mean to say, Cornelius," Josie said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You've had 3 banks turn me away on your say-so. You've called this meeting to do it a 4th time, in front of everyone, so no one asks questions later about how a ranch that's never missed a payment ended up in your hands for 1/3 its worth." A murmur ran through the room. Whitmore's smile thinned. "That is a serious accusation." "It's a true one," Josie said, and here she did not stop, because she had spent 23 days deciding exactly what she meant to say, and she was not going to be talked over now. "I have run that ranch for 11 months without my father, and I ran half of it for years before that, while he was living. I have never missed a payment, never let a fence fall, never lost a season's calves to neglect. The only thing that has changed since my father died is the name signed at the bottom of the note, and apparently, in this town, that is reason enough to call a woman unreliable, unsound, and unfit to hold what she built with her own 2 hands. I am done being spoken about as though I am not standing in the room. If there is something about the word no, you require me to clarify further, Cornelius, I am happy to say it as many times as it takes." The lobby was dead silent. Mrs. Pruitt, for once in her life, did not have anything to say. Whitmore recovered his composure first, reaching for the only weapon he had left. "Sentiment aside, Miss Calloway, the note is due in 3 days, and unless the full sum is paid, the bank will proceed with—" "The note will be paid in full," Emmett Cole said, stepping through the crowd to stand beside her, "because I'm co-signing it, today, in front of every witness in this room." He set a folded document on the counter, not the note itself, but a letter, procured through a contact of Nils's who'd once worked the Helena rail office. It was a copy of correspondence between Whitmore and a silent land buyer, discussing the Calloway Spring and its value to the proposed rail spur, dated 2 weeks before the first refusal from Miles Crossing. "You've been planning to take that water before you ever refused her a dime," Emmett said. "Every bank that turned her down did it on a wire from your desk. That's not board policy, Cornelius. That's a man rigging the game so he can buy stolen ground cheap and call it business." Whitmore's face went the color of old paper. He opened his mouth to argue and found, in front of half the town of Larkspur, that there was nothing left to argue with. He looked, for the first time since Josie had known him, like a man doing arithmetic he did not like the sum of. "This is a private banking matter," he tried, weakly, reaching for a tone of authority that had already left the room, along with everyone's patience for him. "It stopped being private the moment you called this meeting to shame her in front of the whole valley," Emmett said. "You wanted witnesses, Cornelius. You've got them. Someone near the back of the lobby, one of the ranchers who'd banked with Whitmore for a decade, muttered something about withdrawing his own note first thing Monday morning, and the murmur that followed made it plain he wasn't alone in the thought. Mrs. Pruitt, standing near her forgotten ribbon display, had gone very quiet indeed, her earlier certainty draining visibly out of her posture. Emmett did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He set his own signature beneath Josie's on the renewal papers, the note settled and secured in full, and the crowd that had come expecting a foreclosure watched instead as Cornelius Whitmore's scheme came apart in the space of 5 minutes, in his own lobby, with his own letter as the proof of it. Josie signed last, her hand steady, and did not once look at Whitmore as she did it. She had said everything to him she intended to say, and the papers on the counter said the rest. 3 weeks later, on a clear evening with the whole valley gone gold in the last of the light, Emmett Cole rode up to the Calloway house and found Josie on the porch, mending a bridle by lamplight, much the way he'd first seen her doing something similar behind her own barn a lifetime of Sundays ago. He did not make a long speech of it. That was never his way. "I've been turning something over," he said, "since before that meeting at the bank, if I'm honest. Longer than that, maybe." "Turning what over?" Josie said, setting the bridle down. "Whether to ask you to marry me," Emmett said plainly, "and I want to be clear about why, because I expect half this valley will assume it's about the ranch, or the water, or because a lonely man finally found someone to share a house with. It isn't any of that." She stood slowly and said nothing, because she had learned by now that he always finished what he started. "You're the most capable person I know," he said. "Man or woman, doesn't matter. You held that ranch together through a year that would have broken most people, and you did it without once asking anyone to feel sorry for you. You don't lie to me, and you don't flatter me, and you say exactly what you mean even when it costs you something to say it. That's rare. I've looked a long while and never found it in anyone else." He paused. "I'm not asking because of your land, and I'm not asking despite anything about you. I'm asking because you're the finest, steadiest, most honest person I've met in 34 years, and I don't intend to spend the rest of my life pretending I could do better." Josie's eyes were wet, though she did not, even now, let herself cry outright. "That's the longest speech I've ever heard you give, Emmett Cole." "Figured it was worth the extra words," he said. "Just this once." She said yes on the porch, in the lamplight, with no one else there to witness it but the horses in the paddock and the mended bridle between them. The wedding, 3 weeks later, was small and plain, held in the yard of the Calloway ranch house under a stand of cottonwoods, no lace, no imported silk, just good bread and roasted beef and the whole valley in attendance, because word travels fast in a small town, and everyone, it seemed, wanted to see it for themselves. Mrs. Almira Pruitt, of all people, was heard telling a neighbor near the punch bowl that Josephine Calloway, Cole now, was the sturdiest woman this valley has ever had the good sense to keep, and meant it, this time, as the plain compliment it was. 5 years passed. The Calloway Coal Ranch, as it came to be known, ran twice the cattle it had the year Josie's father died, its spring water still running clean and unclaimed by any railroad, its fences mended every Sunday, out of habit more than necessity. Josie and Emmett had a daughter with her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's quiet way of watching a thing before speaking on it, and a son not far behind. Cornelius Whitmore had left Larkspur inside the year. His position at the bank quietly ended once the letter Emmett produced made its way to the Territorial Banking Commission. The Larkspur Trust and Savings had a new manager by then, younger and considerably more careful about whose notes he refused and why. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, 5 years on, that a young widow named Dinah Voss rode into the yard, dust-covered and near tears, having just come from the very same bank counter where Josie herself had once stood. "They won't renew my note," Dinah said, twisting her hat in her hands. "Say a widow alone can't be trusted with a herd that size. I don't know where else to turn." Josie looked at her for a long moment, at the same tired, determined set of the shoulders she remembered wearing herself, once, in that same lobby, and did not hesitate. "You'll turn here," she said. "Come inside. We'll go over your books together, and then my husband and I will ride into town with you Thursday morning, and we'll see what that bank has to say about turning away another woman who's never missed a payment in her life." Thursday morning came, and Josie rode into town alongside Dinah Voss and Emmett both, and stood at that same bank counter where she had once been told, gently, that some things simply could not be saved. The new manager, a careful young man named Foster who had learned a great deal from watching his predecessor's downfall, reviewed Dinah's ledgers without a single comment about widowhood or continuity or the steadiness of anyone's shoulders, and approved the note within the hour. Dinah Voss's ranch made it through that winter, and the one after, and every one since. She named her firstborn calf-crop bull half in jest, after the fence post Emmett had mended that first Sunday years back, a story she'd heard so many times from Josie that it had become, in its own small way, part of the valley's folklore. The women of Larkspur no longer whispered about Josie Calloway Cole's shoulders behind gloved hands. They spoke, instead, of the woman who had built a ranch, faced down a banker, and never once let the world's opinion of her decide what she was capable of holding. Young girls in town, the kind who'd once been told to make themselves smaller and quieter to be liked, took to watching her cross the street with her children at her heels and her husband a half-step behind, and understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that there was more than one way to be the kind of woman a whole valley respected. No one had ever needed to approve of her for her to be right. She had simply been right, all along, and had waited, patiently, and then no longer patiently at all, for the world to catch up to what she already knew.